Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking something that often just flashes past in the news cycle, political statements, maybe even controversial ones, and we're going to look at them through a very different lens.
Right, the lens of intelligence analysis.
Exactly. Think about some recent moments. We saw, for instance, Donald Trump making claims about India. Two specifically stand out. First, that he'd personally mediated between India and Pakistan after significant military events like Operation Sindoor.
A pretty major claim.
And second, maybe even more impactful, his statement that he'd spoken directly with India and secured an agreement for them to stop buying Russian oil immediately.
And that's where it gets interesting from an analysis perspective, because India's Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA, they pushed back hard and fast.
They did. Flat-out rebuttals. They stated very clearly, look, neither that conversation about oil happened, nor did the mediation you're talking about.
So you have these, let's call them factually questionable statements from a major political figure being directly contradicted by the country involved.
Most people just see that as, politics, campaign talk, maybe noise. But our sources, particularly looking at how Indian external intelligence views this, see something else entirely.
Precisely. This isn't seen as just noise or a mistake. In intelligence circles, this kind of event is often categorized quite specifically. It falls under what's known as strategic perception manipulation.
Strategic perception manipulation. Okay, that sounds deliberate, calculated.
It is. It implies a very conscious effort. It's seen as a mix, really a blend of psychological operations and information influence operations.
So if the statements, like the oil one, are demonstrably false, what's the real objective? It can't be simply to convince India of the falsehood, right? They know it didn't happen.
No, the target isn't necessarily belief in the falsehood itself. It's about leveraging the reaction to that falsehood to achieve other strategic aims. It's a multi-vector approach.
Okay, let's unpack those aims. If this is such a sophisticated tactic, what are the broad objectives that, say, Indian intelligence agencies are looking for when they see this?
Our analysis points to three main goals they watch for. First, and maybe most obviously, it's about putting pressure on decision makers.
You mean forcing their hand?
Exactly. Trying to compel India's top leadership, think prime minister level, to react publicly, to clarify their stance, maybe even hoping the pressure forces a shift in their policy architecture. You float a sensitive claim like halting Russian oil.
And hope the denial process itself somehow nudges their actual policy.
Or at least forces them to reveal more about their thinking. The second objective is about shaping the story globally. Public narrative manipulation.
How so?
Well, the statement goes out worldwide. Trump says India agreed to stop buying Russian oil. Even if it's denied, the headline plants an idea.
An idea that the U.S. can sort of dictate terms to India.
Precisely. It challenges India's stated policy of strategic autonomy. It crafts a narrative, however briefly, that the U.S. is in the driver's seat, influencing India's major geopolitical decisions. It's about perception management on a global scale.
Right, chipping away at that image of independence, which is crucial for India's relations with, Russia, Iran, others.
Absolutely. And the third objective, that's often about the immediate tangible effects, market distortion.
Ah, the economic angle.
Yes. These kinds of high-level, high-impact statements act as disruptive signals. They inject uncertainty into global markets, specifically targeting, in these cases, energy, trade, and currency sectors. Ambiguity can be exploited.
Okay, but it still feels like a big gamble for a political figure's credibility.
Yeah.
Why use the political voice for this? Why not a more traditional intelligence channel, like a leak?
That leads to a key term our sources use, white zone coercive signal.
White zone.
Yes, it means using the authority and platform of a high-level political figure, could be current, could be former, to push these signals. The key is it doesn't leave the direct fingerprints of an intelligence agency, like the CIA or NSA.
So, plausible deniability.
Essentially. If an agency were caught fabricating, the diplomatic blowback would be immense. But a political statement, it operates in a different space. It's often treated as, well, just politics, even while it serves an underlying intelligence or policy goal. It advances the agenda without the same level of official accountability.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. So the signal is launched, this white zone coercive signal. India refutes it. Everyone kind of knows it's not true. How do intelligence agencies like India's turn this deliberate falsehood into something useful for them? What are they actually studying?
They kick immediately into high gear with something called trigger response mapping, and this is done quite aggressively.
Trigger response mapping. Okay, walk us through that. How do they map the reaction?
It starts, obviously, with the trigger. That's the false statement itself, the mediation claim, the oil halt assertion.
Got it.
Then, crucially, comes the observation of response. Intelligence services watch very closely who within the Indian system resonates with this, or, more importantly, who is involved in crafting the response. Is it the Petroleum Ministry scrambling? Is the National Security Advisor involved? The Foreign Minister? They're looking for the ripples inside the government.
Trying to see who gets activated by the trigger.
Exactly. And then perhaps the most critical part is the reaction impulse study. This is about time.
Yeah.
They measure rigorously the time elapsed between the U.S. statement hitting the public domain and the official Indian rebuttal, typically from the MEA spokesperson.
Why is the timing so important?
Because that time lag tells a story. A very rapid response, say within just a couple of hours, might suggest a pre-planned protocol or potentially even panic, an emotional reaction. Whereas a more measured response, maybe taking 12 or 24 hours, suggests coordination. It implies they took time to consult internally, maybe even with allies, before issuing a calibrated statement. It helps profile whether India's decision-making loop on this issue is reactive and emotional or strategic and deliberate.
So the U.S. tries to set the pace, and how India chooses to run that race sprint or steady jog is itself a piece of intelligence.
A very important piece. And tied directly to this is the hierarchy analysis. They don't just look at when India responds, but who delivers the response.
Well, you mentioned the MEA spokesperson.
Yes, and sources point to this being a specific point of, let's say, American analytical interest, maybe even frustration. The counterstatement often comes from a relatively junior official, the spokesperson, not a cabinet minister, not the foreign secretary, not the national security advisor.
Why would that frustrate the U.S. analysts? I mean, a rebuttal's a rebuttal, isn't it?
Well, think about the signal mismatch. The U.S. trigger was launched from the highest political echelon, implicitly demanding attention at that same level. When India responds using a spokesperson, it's a signal in itself.
A signal of dismissal.
Precisely. It communicates, we acknowledge your statement, but we consider it political noise, not worthy of a top-level strategic response. It denies the U.S. the A-level engagement they were trying to provoke. They wanted to see how the top minds reacted under pressure, and instead they get a formal, lower-level brush-off. It complicates their analysis of the core decision-makers.
That makes sense. Denying them the data point they wanted from the top tier.
And that very denial, that lack of high-level engagement, leads naturally into the second major analytical method they employ, the behavioral diagnostic probe.
Okay, if trigger response mapping is about the official government reaction, what's the diagnostic probe looking at?
It shifts the focus from the government to the broader domestic environment within India. The goal here is to diagnose which internal entities, non-governmental ones, might actually align with or amplify the American position.
So identifying potential sympathizers or influencers.
Essentially, yes. Or at least identifying who is susceptible to that line of argument. The method involves intensive observation. They monitor which think tanks start researching the topic based on the U.S. statement, which media houses run prominent stories, which specific news anchors give it significant airtime, which social media influencers pick it up and amplify it.
They're tracking the spread and the sentiment.
Exactly. They look at the volume of discussion generated by these domestic actors, and the polarity is the coverage critical, neutral, or, most importantly, supportive of the original U.S. claim or its underlying premise.
So it's like building a map of potential domestic allies or channels for future influence operations.
That's a good way to put it. Identifying these amplifiers helps the U.S. understand which domestic entities might be willing, consciously or unconsciously, to help advance an American narrative or policy objective within India itself. It's about understanding the internal landscape for future messaging.
Okay, so they've mapped the government's reaction time and level. They've probed the domestic amplifiers. What happens next? How does this play out on the global stage? What's the operational response analysis look like there?
Right. This moves into the next phase, often involving narrative conditioning globally. The initial false statement, even after being debunked, serves a purpose beyond India.
Oh.
Take the India halted Russian oil claim. The U.S. can use that narrative, implicitly or explicitly, to message other countries that are buying Russian oil, especially those under U.S. pressure.
Using India as a kind of warning or example.
Exactly. The underlying message becomes, look, if we can supposedly influence a major independent economy like India on this critical issue, then the pressure certainly applies to you. It attempts to set a global expectation or benchmark, even based on a fiction.
And the mediation claim, how does that fit?
That's more about conflict messaging. By asserting a mediation role in a complex, sensitive situation like India-Pakistan, even falsely, the U.S. signals to other global conflict zones, think Russia-Ukraine, or others, that it remains the indispensable power, the ultimate mediator, regardless of what other global players might think or want.
It's reinforcing its own perceived centrality. But these actions carry risks, surely, particularly with allies or strategic partners. You mentioned the India-Russia relationship earlier.
Absolutely. And that leads to what is perhaps one of the more serious applications, the diplomatic provocation test.
Provocation. That sounds intentionally damaging.
It can be. The false statement about India halting Russian oil purchases isn't just aimed at India or the global audience. It directly impacts Russia. Russian energy officials, their intelligence analysts, they see this statement from a top U.S. figure. They are almost forced to seek clarification from their Indian counterparts.
Creating friction where none existed.
Precisely. India now has to spend diplomatic energy reassuring Russia, managing the fallout from a statement it didn't make. This injects a small wedge, a potential trust deficit, into the India-Russia relationship. The U.S. gets to observe how both sides handle this artificially induced strain, testing the resilience and perhaps the private communication channels of that partnership.
Wow. Okay, and let's not forget the money angle you brought up. Market distortion for intelligence gain. How does that work in practice? If India is pressured into clarifying, maybe releasing some data, how does that become an intelligence advantage for the U.S.?
It's quite direct. So the political statement acts the trigger. India feels compelled to clarify its position on Russian oil imports, maybe releasing a percentage figure or some aggregated data to counter the narrative.
Open source information, technically.
Technically, yes, but it's information released under pressure prompted by the U.S. signal. U.S. intelligence agencies then scoop up this data using OSINT, open source intelligence techniques, and integrate it into their broader energy intelligence map.
What does that map tell them?
It helps them refine their understanding of India's energy dependencies, maybe its storage capacities, its diversification efforts, its key suppliers. This isn't just academic. It informs U.S. strategic and commercial interests. It helps the U.S. identify potential future export opportunities for its own energy products to India.
And disrupts the market simultaneously.
Yes, because forcing that data out, even vaguely, creates short-term ambiguity about India's future buying patterns. Will they buy less from Russia, more from somewhere else? This uncertainty ripples through the crude oil futures markets, affects shipping insurance rates, influences long-term trade negotiations. It creates churn. And where there's churn and better intelligence on one side, there's potential for short-term market advantage and profit.
So the political statement essentially becomes a tool to force proprietary-level insights into the public domain for strategic and economic gain.
That's a key part of the playbook. According to this analysis, it all ties together.
This really reframes things. These seemingly off-the-cuff political remarks are actually potentially deeply calculated maneuvers.
That's how they're analyzed, yes. From the trigger-response mapping to the hierarchy analysis, the behavioral probes, the narrative conditioning, the diplomatic provocation, the market distortion, it's all seen as part of a sophisticated form of calculated cognitive testing.
Cognitive testing.
Yes, testing the target nation's strategic reflexes, their internal cohesion, their key relationships. They're continuously measuring reaction times, analyzing sentiment graphs from media responses, tracking how the message propagates across different platforms. The ultimate aim, as the sources suggest, is to constantly probe and, where possible, punch holes in India's strategic autonomy, testing its resilience in real time.
So the big takeaway for listeners, when you see these kinds of high-profile, controversial, quickly debunked statements by major political figures about other countries, don't just dismiss it as noise. It might be a deliberate, multi-layered influence operation designed to generate pressure, map responses, test relationships, and potentially manipulate global narratives and markets.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something our source material hints at. This kind of aggressive strategy, this constant need to test and try to control the strategic autonomy of others, to assert influence sometimes through, well, less than factual means. Historically, that can sometimes be characteristic of a major power feeling a bit desperate, trying to reassert its dominance, maybe in its perceived twilight. It's worth considering that framework when you observe these kinds of geopolitical statements playing out elsewhere in the world, too. Ask, why the lie? What reaction are they really trying to measure?